You're lying still now, allowing your mind to drift through the slow corridors of time. Tonight, we'll begin in the dusty, humming city of Kano, one of the oldest continually inhabited places in sub-Saharan Africa. But tonight, we won't chase battles, rebellions, or golden conquests. No, instead, we will settle down quietly beside the worry wooden looms and silken threads that spun power and prestige in one of West Africa's least discussed legacies. The weaving dynasties of Kano. Around the early 15th century, Kano was thriving, though part of the Hausa city-states. It wasn't just a center for politics or trade. It was a textile empire. When you think of kings, perhaps you picture crowns, jewels, or mounted warriors. But in Kano, true power was often measured in fabrics, in finely dyed cotton, delicate indigo robes, and the mastery of a craft that stretched back centuries. By 1450, under the reign of King Muhammadu Rumfa, Kano had already become a central trading post between the North African merchants of the Sahara and the forested empires to the south. But more than salt or ivory, what made Kano remarkable was its weaving economy, sustained not by mighty warriors, but by everyday artisans, many of them born into families who had woven for generations. Their looms clicked day and night, creating fine strips of cotton cloth, known locally as zamia and sanyan, that would be sewn together to form flowing robes called babanuga. These weren't just clothes. In Hausa culture, clothing communicated lineage, status, spirituality, and even marital eligibility. The dyeing pits sunk in earthen vats filled with fermented indigo lined the Kofa Mata district, one of the oldest surviving dyeing quarters in the world. There, the cloth was soaked and dyed by men who had spent decades learning to control the delicate pH balances and natural fermentation processes. This wasn't a quick process. Each robe could take weeks of careful soaking, drying, and folding. It was deliberate, almost meditative. And that's exactly how power moved in Kano during this era, quietly, deliberately. You see, the kings of Kano didn't rule with brute strength alone. They carefully curated their public image, and textiles were at the heart of this. Royal garments weren't just luxurious. They were symbols of divine favor, of wisdom, of distance. From the common man, a finely dyed robe could elevate a person socially more than 100 soldiers might. These garments were so powerful in their symbolism that they were often given as tribute to other rulers, or as sacred diplomatic gifts to religious scholars and emissaries from Timbuktu. The weavers themselves, they were respected, though rarely powerful. Most belonged to endogamous craft guilds that passed skills down through families. A young boy would learn the slow rhythm of the loom from his father, who had learned it from his grandfather. Women were rarely weavers in the public workshops, but they managed the spinning of raw cotton and the intricate embroidery that would be added at home. A day in the life of a weaver was repetitive, yes, but never meaningless. At dawn he would untie the long cotton threads stretched across his loom, adjust his tension beams, and begin the rhythmic passage of the shuttle, left to right, right to left. The work was as much spiritual as it was physical. Many believed that certain weaving patterns carried baraka or spiritual energy. A robe made with care could protect its wearer, while one made hastily or with impure intentions could invite illness or misfortune. The city of Kano was surrounded by vast fields of cotton, most of it tended to by tenant farmers who traded their harvests for a share of the final woven goods. Cotton was the cash crop of the city, but it was also its political thread. Kings taxed the cotton harvest, regulated dye production, and controlled access to certain high-status garments. If you weren't of noble lineage, you could wear indigo, but only royalty and scholars could wear turbaned whites, the dazzling robes that glowed in desert sunlight, bleached and folded with near-sacred precision. By the late 1500s, Kano's textile economy had expanded across West Africa, with caravans carrying bolts of indigo cloth to the markets of Gao, Timbuktu, and as far as Tripoli. But despite this trade, the methods in Kano remained mostly unchanged. The looms, often carved from local hardwoods, still squeaked under the sun, the dye pits still gurgled with the smell of fermentation, and the king still stepped out in robes that shimmered with subtle messages about his role as ruler, mediator, and chosen one. What's rarely mentioned in history books is how this economy was stabilized, not by state institutions or complex banks, but by trust guild alliances, oral contracts, and an unspoken system of respect. Clothes were currency, but also memory. A robe passed down from father to son was not just a garment, it was a record of lineage, of triumphs, of spiritual promises. For a city so full of sound and trade, it's fascinating how much it relied on silence. the quiet labor of a weaver, the whisper of cloth folding over a wooden stall, the hum of a loom continuing its unbroken rhythm for generations. As you rest. Now, imagine yourself walking through the textile quarter of Kano in the year 1520. The scent of fermented indigo clings to the air. The ground is warm beneath your feet. The voices of weavers echo softly in Hausa as they joke, work, and chant while the sun sets beyond the earthen walls of the city. You pass a young boy carefully aligning threads on his father's loom, not realizing that his work is part of a legacy older than many kingdoms. And perhaps that's the question, worth sleeping on tonight. Why do we remember the kings, but not the weavers who made them kings? Dyes, gilds, and royal threads. When you open your eyes again, the sun has risen slightly higher above the city of Kano, casting a gentle warmth over the stone alleys and ochre-colored walls. The morning air carries a damp, bitter scent of fermentation, and smoke from cooking fires mingled with the sharp tank of lye. You're still in the textile quarter, but today, we step deeper. Not into the markets this time, but into the very infrastructure of weaving, the silent scaffolding of society held together by threads and dyed robes. We begin with indigo, that brilliant, deep blue hue that defined an era. It wasn't just a color in Kano, it was a symbol of dignity, maturity, and spiritual protection. Indigo wasn't extracted easily, it came from the leaves of the indigofera plant, which were harvested, fermented, and processed using tightly guarded methods passed down through dyeing guilds. These guilds operated like small republics within the city, each governed by its own leaders, its own codes of conduct, and its own unspoken hierarchy. The master dyers, or masurini, were highly respected. They knew not only the proper chemical balances for fermentation, but also the correct timing for each soak. One error 1 hour too long, or a misstep in folding and the cloth would come out dull, streaked, or worse, dead, a term the Dutch used for cloth that had failed to absorb life from the dye. Dyers believed, in fact, that the vat itself had moods, living, breathing temperaments shaped by weather, prayer, and intention. They would offer small invocations before lowering the cloth into the pit, whispering to the spirit of the dye, hoping for favor. Once dyed, the cloth went to the finishers. These artisans worked under awnings, where the sunlight could dry the strips just so. Then came the tailors and embroiderers, many of whom were women. Their needles carried generational knowledge, carefully stitching patterns known as zane, geometric, repetitive designs that varied by family, class, or religious affiliation. Some patterns were strictly off limits. You couldn't wear the embroidery of a scholar unless you were initiated into a Sufi order. Nor could a merchant mimic the garb of nobility without attracting unwanted attention or punishment. But none of these stages existed in isolation. They were part of a tightly regulated guild economy, where each occupation, dyers, weavers, tailors, embroiders, had its own internal leadership. The guilds set prices, maintained standards, resolved disputes, and ensured that apprentices were properly trained. Entry wasn't just a matter of skill, it was about lineage, family, reputation, and sometimes spiritual approval. You didn't simply decide to become a weaver. You were born into the rhythm of the loom. And still, at the center of this web of cloth and craft was the king, the Saki. His position wasn't maintained by mere military power. It was protected, legitimized, and reinforced by appearances, by robes. Take, for example, the Riga Nasaki, the robe of the king, worn during Friday prayers or courtly processions. It was layered, often triple-folded, made of narrow hand-woven strips, joined edge to edge. Each seam was precise. Each hem was folded like scripture. The outermost layer would often be indigo-dyed cotton, overlaid with white muslin, or silk imported via Saharan trade routes. The king's turban might take days to wind correctly, and not by the king himself, of course, but by skilled attendants who had studied the ceremonial folds since childhood. These garments were so significant that they were often recorded in diplomatic reports. Visitors from North Africa, or even European travelers in later centuries, were stunned by the richness and precision of Hausa dress. But this opulence didn't mean disorder. Quite the opposite. It signaled a well-oiled economic and symbolic machine, where clothing reflected not vanity, but stability. End. It wasn't only royalty who used clothing as a form of communication. Merchants, too, used their garments as business cards. A merchant from Katsina might wear a folded cap and richly dyed tunic, indicating not only his trade network but his religious affiliations, important in a time when contracts were often sealed by spiritual oaths. A cleric's robe might show Quranic verses stitched subtly into the hem, barely visible to outsiders. but deeply meaningful to those within the tradition. Still, even with all this care and spiritual attention, the world outside Kano was changing. By the 1600s, external trade pressures were beginning to affect the city's textile economy. Caravans from Morocco and Ottoman North Africa brought cheaper, factory-made fabrics, which some local nobles began to favor for their novelty. The guilds resisted. They held special meetings, urging loyalty to local artisans, reminding patrons of the spiritual integrity of Kano cloth. But prices dropped. Some younger weavers left their looms to try their luck in trade or migration. It was the slow beginning of a shift, not a collapse, but a loosening of the threads that had once held everything so tightly together. To protect the guilds, kings began issuing edicts. Certain garments were made royal only, imports were taxed, but the dye pits were already growing quieter, and whispers began spreading. Were foreign fabrics a sign of progress, or betrayal? Still, at the heart of it all, the dye pits remained. The Kofa Mata pits, just outside the ancient city walls, continued to bubble and ferment. Cloth still came, in smaller amounts perhaps, but dyed with care. The oldest dyers, now grey-bearded and bowed, still showed up before sunrise, preparing their vats with the slow patience of men who knew the rhythm of the earth. The looms still clicked, fewer than before, but no less precise, no less sacred. There are records from the mid-17th century describing Kono's resistance to foreign cloth as both admirable and impractical. That's a fair assessment. The kings and weavers of Kano knew they couldn't hold back the tide of change forever. But they also knew something the outside world forgot. That fabric wasn't just a commodity. It was memory, structure, and identity. One royal advisor was quoted as saying, "A nation that forgets how to weave its cloth will soon forget how to govern its people." Perhaps a poetic exaggeration, but perhaps not. And so, as you rest tonight, consider this image. A young weaver in 1640, sitting at a worn loom inherited from his father. He knows his city is changing. He's heard the rumors of cheaper cloth, of disappearing guilds. But he picks up his shuttle anyway, left to right to left, slowly, patiently, as if the act of weaving itself could hold back time. Can the quiet labor of a weaver resist the noise of the world? A thread unraveled, a legacy rewoven. You wake again slowly, gently, as the city of Kano grows quieter, older, more contemplative. We've moved forward now to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, where history shifts not with a boom, but with a hush. The loom still clicks in the background, but the rhythm is slower. The dye pits bubble more faintly. Change has arrived, not as an invader, but as a whisper carried in the folds of imported cloth. Colonial policy, and the slow erosion of a centuries-old guild system. But tonight, we do not mourn the fall, we study the transformation. By the late 1700s, Kano's textile tradition, once the heartbeat of the city, was being challenged from multiple sides. Imported fabrics from Europe began flooding Saharan trade routes. French and English textiles, produced in factories powered by machines that never tired, reached markets once dominated by patient, hand-woven hausa cloth. These imports were cheap, vibrant, intriguing, and disruptive. Still, the guilds endured for a time. Many adapted. Some began to mimic foreign styles or adjust their dyeing methods to appeal to new tastes. The color palette widened. Red and yellow, pigments, rare in Kano's earlier history, were now introduced alongside traditional indigo. Garments grew more experimental, even ostentatious. But beneath the innovation was a fracture, the invisible thread weakening under the strain of colonial economics. The British arrival in the 19th century, first indirectly through trade and later through colonial control, brought drastic change. The Royal Niger Company established dominance over the region's commerce, and in 1903, British colonial forces formally annexed Kano into the northern Nigeria Protectorate. A new authority entered the city, one that didn't understand the spiritual economy of indigo, or the sacred rhythms of the loom. To the British, the Kano textile industry was a commodity system, not a cultural one. They taxed production, registered guild leaders as mere labor managers, and encouraged the use of imported British cloth in official contexts. Suddenly, robes dyed and stitched in Manchester carried more administrative value than those woven in Kofa Mata. Yet amid the transformation, something surprising occurred. Resistance, not through rebellion, but through ritual. You see, the artisans didn't vanish. They adapted, but they did not forget. The dye pits, for instance, were never fully abandoned. Even as British authorities promoted factory imports, local dyers continued their work, sometimes in secret, sometimes under the guise of religious ceremonies. The dye pits became repositories of memory, spaces where the past was preserved not in words but in action. Cloth dyed in those ancient vats was still worn at weddings, funerals, and Friday prayers. Wearing locally dyed indigo became, in many circles, a quiet protest, a declaration of continuity in the face of change. The guilds, too, adjusted. Many became less rigid, less formal. Lineages shifted. Outsiders could sometimes buy their way in, but the essence of the craft, its slowness, its spirituality remained. A young weaver learning to align his shuttle in 1908 was still learning techniques older than his language. Though the social infrastructure had been altered, the fabric of practice remained largely intact. This is the hidden truth. The British never fully dismantled Kano's textile economy. They redirected it, introduced new patterns of consumption, reshaped trade, and imposed bureaucracy. But the old ways held fast in corners of the city, untouched by policy, down alleys where looms still clacked under woven mats, and where dye pits breathed gently beneath clay domes. Then came the 20th century, with its own tempo. After Nigeria gained independence in 1960, Kano's textile identity underwent yet another transformation. This time, it wasn't foreign power that dictated change. It was modernization, urbanization, electricity, and mass-produced clothing from Asia further eroded the prominence of hand-woven cloth. Young men once destined to be weavers sought careers in business, education, or government. The guilds thinned, apprenticeships declined, and yet, even as the city modernized, it never entirely severed its textile soul. In the 1970s, it was modest, but meaningful. Cultural preservation initiatives encouraged the documentation of weaving techniques, the protection of dye pits, and the celebration of Hausa textile heritage. Local festivals began highlighting traditional garments. Tourists were invited to see the ancient dyeing pits of Kofamata, which amazingly were still in use. Some pits were over 500 years old, and still fermenting with the same methods as in the days of King Muhammadu Ramfa. Old master dyers, now grandfathers and great-grandfathers, became living libraries. Their hands knew more about Kano's history than any textbook, and still their movements remained patient, repetitive, sacred. One such master, Malam Usman, was interviewed in the 1990s. He said this: "When I was a boy, my grandfather would talk to the dye before he placed the cloth in the vat. He would whisper, 'Take this cloth like a child into your belly and return it with honor.' And I still whisper this, even now. Even if no one listens, the cloth listens." That's the story most never hear. Not of conquest, but of quiet continuity, of people who refuse to forget, even when forgotten. And now, as you lie in stillness, you may wonder, does any of this matter today? In some ways, yes. Today, Kano's traditional textile economy still exists. Fragile, yes, but present. The dye pits of Kofamata remain open, though many are now partially supported by cultural organizations and heritage grants. Some young apprentices have returned to the craft, encouraged by efforts to revive local traditions. Textile cooperatives have formed, blending tradition with new technologies such as solar dryers, natural dye extraction systems, digital pattern archiving. Tourists walk the alleys, yes, but some come to learn, not just to see. There are efforts to preserve Zayn embroidery patterns digitally, using 3D scans and stitch mapping software. Oral histories of the guilds are being transcribed by local historians, and in some schools, children now learn not only arithmetic and geography but the cultural meanings of robes, and why indigo matters. You may find that quiet almost boring, but there's a kind of miracle in that monotony. A thread never broken, merely frayed. And so, we close this first story not with a battle, or a treaty, or the rise and fall of dynasties. We close it with a man at a loom, older than the century. His fingers are still steady. The sun is warming the wall beside him. A child nearby, watching silently, not yet weaving but curious. And as he moves the shuttle left to right, right to left, he teaches not just a skill, but a worldview. That patience can resist progress, that memory can survive neglect, and that some kingdoms are woven, not conquered. So, tonight, as the loom falls silent and the last robe is folded, consider this. What stories are woven into the clothes you wear, and how many of them have already been forgotten? Story 2. The Robes of Resistance, Textile Rebellions in the Asante Empire. Stitched in Defiance. Tonight, we leave the dusty plains of Kano behind and drift southward into the humid forests of what is now Ghana. You are walking under thick canopies where leaves shimmer with the sheen of recent rainfall. The earth here smells of wet bark, kola nuts, and distant fire smoke. You find yourself in the city of Kumasi, capital of the Asante Empire, around the year 1800. But once again, this is not a story of swords or gold-laden thrones. This is a story told not in shouts but in threads. The Asante Empire, much like the Hausa kingdoms to the north, was not merely a military or economic force, it was a cultural behemoth. And central to that culture was cloth, specifically, kente. Cloth. When most people today think of kente, they imagine bright, colorful patterns of reds, greens, yellows woven into tight, geometric symbols. And yes, kente is beautiful, but its beauty isn't just aesthetic. In the 1800s Kumasi, every strip, color, and stitch of a kente cloth carried meaning. It was a language, a system of signs, a political message wrapped around the body. But let's pause here, because before kente was royal, it was sacred. According to oral histories, the first kente cloth was woven by two Asante hunters, Kurugu and Amio, who observed a spider spinning its web in the forest. They mimicked its movements using raffia fibers, creating the earliest version of what would become the most recognized cloth in West Africa. Over generations, kente evolved. Raffia gave way to silk and cotton. The patterns grew more complex, and eventually kente became the exclusive right of kings. By the late 1700s, only royals, priests, and court dignitaries could wear certain patterns. The Asanahin, the king, wore designs with proverbs embedded in them. One robe might symbolize, "The king is as constant as the earth beneath your feet." Another might warn, "Do not bite the hand that feeds you." These meanings were woven, not spoken. The message wasn't for the ears, it was for the eyes. Weavers, known as Ensajua Sofa, worked in sun-drenched courtyards, usually men, sitting at narrow looms that used foot pedals and hand shuttles. The weaving was done in strips, often no more than 4 inches wide. These strips were later sewn together to form a larger cloth, sometimes up to 24 strips wide, meant to be worn draped over one shoulder, like a toga. The cloth's colors, too, were chosen with care. Black stood for spiritual energy and maturity. Red was for sacrifice, often worn during times of war or mourning. Gold signified royalty, wealth, and glory. Green represents growth, harvest, and renewal. No color was random. No pattern was decorative alone. Wearing a certain combination of symbols and shades was as significant as making a public statement. It could honor ancestors, criticize leaders, or call for unity. But what happens when a cloth speaks too loudly? Let us travel now to the 1807 Festival of Aquaseed, a sacred event where the Asanahin appeared before the people, accompanied by royal court members, priests, and warriors. On this occasion, however, something unusual occurred. Several weavers, craftsmen of high guild rank, unveiled a new cloth pattern titled Wo Ko Me, Na Meko Wo, you fight me, and I fight you. The pattern used red and black in sharp contrast, symbolic of grief and rebellion. The message, a subtle critique of the king's recent decision to impose new taxes on local crafts, including weaving. The cloth was worn not by warriors or dissenters, but by the weavers' own apprentices during the festival procession. This was not a shouted protest. There were no riots, no petitions, no threats, just cloth. But everyone understood. The palace took notice. The king's advisors demanded an explanation, but the guild elders remained silent. They bowed, they smiled, and they kept weaving. Over the following months, several new patterns began circulating quietly through Kumasi's markets. One cloth, called Semi ni Akirakiri Amensuro, among traders, another Kiakio displayed broken lines and jagged edges hinting at tension, dissatisfaction, and unrest. These weren't treasonous acts. They were textile resistance, peaceful, deliberate, rooted in centuries of craft tradition. You see, in Asante culture, speech was often regulated, especially in royal courts, but the weavers had their own tongue, one not easily silenced, the language of cloth. And yet the empire wasn't unaware of the risks. Tensions were rising with the British, who were increasing their influence along the coast. The slave trade, though waning, still loomed large, and Asante alliances with European traders were shifting. In such times, cloth became more than culture, it became strategy. Royal garments during this period began to adopt more conservative messages. The Asanahin's robes featured old, respected patterns, ones associated with ancestral legitimacy, like ebon fence symbolizing safety, and doof wooden comb for cleanliness and love. The court tried to stabilize the symbolism, to quiet the fabric's voice, but the people kept weaving, keep stitching, keep encoding. Imagine this. a cloth merchant in 1812, standing under a mud brick archway near the Kajisha market, unfolding bolts of kente to a group of young men preparing for marriage ceremonies. One of the bolts features the pattern, "Don't climb a tree with thorns if you are barefoot." The phrase has always meant caution in risky ventures, but in that moment, under that political sky, it also warns against foreign entanglements, a message to the future grooms, and perhaps to the state. The cloth travels, it's sold, it's worn, it speaks without a sound. In this era, women too played a vital role. While men wove kente, women often produced adinkra, a type of stamp cloth bearing sacred symbols printed using natural dyes from the Bedi tree. Adinkra was traditionally worn at funerals, but over time, its symbols like eben and kainkim, life's journey, or eben double protection, became political tools. Women printed these symbols onto funeral robes, but also onto everyday garments, wrapping their frustrations, grief, and resistance into designs. There are accounts of entire funeral processions in the 1820s, bearing cloth that criticized British encroachment and the loss of traditional values, not through banners or chants, but through fabric. This wasn't rebellion in the European sense. It wasn't violence. It was cultural resilience, a fabric-based language that adapted to shifting powers, colonial influence, and internal strife. And that's the deeper truth here. The Asante Empire was not merely militaristic or economically rich, it was textile literate. It preserved law, memory, and protest in folds of cloth. In Kumasi, fabric didn't just wrap the body, it wrapped the soul, the state, and the spirit of resistance. So, as you rest your eyes tonight, picture a courtyard in 1815. A boy sits at a loom under the watch of his father. The sun cuts a hard angle across his face. His shuttle moves carefully. Click, pull, pass, press. The pattern emerging beneath his fingers is called Naya Gaidi. Have faith. He doesn't yet know what's happening in the palace. He doesn't understand trade routes or taxation or rebellion, but he's learning something more ancient. That meaning can be hidden in the most ordinary things, that the quietest protests are often the most enduring. And you might wonder, as the cloth stretches longer beneath his hands, how many revolutions have been hidden in plain sight, stitched silently into the clothes we wear every day. The hidden language of power. When you open your eyes again, the scent of warm palm oil and rain-drenched soil lingers in the air. You're still in Kumasi, but time has slipped forward. The year is now 1824, and the Asante Empire, still powerful, still richly adorned, is inching toward a new kind of confrontation. This time, the resistance won't be spoken aloud or shouted in the streets. Instead, it will once again unfold in silence, thread by thread, in the deliberate movements of weavers and the slow, careful printing of cloth. At this moment, the British are more than distant trading partners. They've begun establishing stronger footholds along the coast, particularly in Cape Coast Castle and Elmina, once shared with the Dutch but now increasingly under British military command. The Asante Empire, led by Asante Empire, lead by Asantehene Ase Tutu Kwame. The looms still hum. The dye pots still simmer with natural indigo and bark. Traders still carry bolts of kente and stamped adinkra cloth across the forest paths, down toward the coast. Yet something subtle has changed. Let's walk again through a workshop in the Adam quarter of Kumasi. Inside, rows of narrow looms sit under thatched awnings. The air is thick with humidity and dust from dried cotton. A weaver sits cross-legged, his right foot tapping the pedal that shifts the warp threads. In his hands, a shuttle moves left to right, dragging a bright red weft. The pattern he's building is called eben double fence. To the untrained eye, it's just a geometric design. But in the year 1824, it carries a whisper, a reminder to stay protected, to close ranks, to be cautious of outsiders. That is the essence of the Asante textile code. Each pattern, each phrase embedded in cloth, is multi-layered. On the surface, the meaning is cultural, but underneath, if you know how to read it, is an entire network of commentary about leadership, betrayal, unity, survival. The robes become a public language of private anxieties. British emissaries in the region began to notice this too. In one report from 1825, a colonial agent observed that certain garments are avoided in the presence of the king, while others seem to be worn deliberately to offend or signal dissatisfaction. He didn't understand the code, of course, but he could sense that something was being said without a single word spoken. Let us pause here and look more closely at how this system operated. By now, adinkra cloth, originally associated with mourning, has spread beyond funerals. Though still worn during rites of passage and ancestor worship, it has become a tool of political commentary. Each symbol stamped using carved calabash blocks dipped in dark dye carries deep philosophical meaning. These symbols are not merely decorative. They are mnemonics for proverbs, warnings, and wisdom. Here are a few symbols widely used during this era. Eben, fence, safety, security, and family. Eben, double fence, a call for internal protection, often interpreted politically during uncertain times. Enkai twistings, life's journey, change, instability. Eben, Adinkra, fortified walls, political resistance, used subtly by leaders who wished to show autonomy from British influence. Hodie, independence, freedom and emancipation, considered bold, even provocative, if worn near colonial officials. Women, who primarily worked with Adinkra, were central to this active textile commentary. In a society where public political speech by women was often restricted, the cloth became their platform. Entire funeral processions could become public statements. In 1826, the widow of a prominent Asante elder wore a robe printed entirely with Enkai symbols, a bold critique of the recent disruption caused by British interference with trade routes. These garments weren't made in anger, they were made with patience. Each piece of cloth took days to prepare, washing, softening, dyeing, then printing. The stamps were pressed with rhythmic care. No two garments were identical. No pattern was meaningless. As British influence expanded, Adinkra symbols grew more layered, even cryptic. Some families commissioned robes with newly invented glyphs, known only within their households. Others revived archaic patterns to mask the true message beneath the veil of tradition. Meanwhile, kente weaving continued at the heart of the royal ceremony. At the Akweside festivals, the Asanahin and his chiefs sat in public courtyards draped in breathtaking cloths, each one a paragraph in an unspoken book of politics, legacy, and moral position. The king might wear a pattern called Sesa Wo Suban, change or transform your character, signifying a call for reform or moral rebirth. His advisors might wear Nakayamkim or Bisaka, the kola nut, a symbol of economic prosperity and diplomacy. Foreign visitors, unaware of the meanings, often described the scene as a riot of color and sound, failing to grasp the precision beneath the pageantry. But the Asante understood, and so did the weavers. At times the weavers acted as subtle agitators, introducing new patterns with double meanings. One cloth, woven in 1827, was named Afina Nyabon, the sword is not the government. It criticized the growing militarization of politics. It was worn by merchants and priests, never soldiers. The pattern became so widespread that the palace quietly discouraged its sale. Still, it spread. Weaving was no longer just about tradition, it was about negotiating modernity. Colonial tension didn't destroy kente, it sharpened its edges. In 1828, the British began restricting the movement of cloth from the interior to the coastal forts. Under the pretext of regulating commerce, they aimed to weaken Asante economic influence and favor European textiles. The Asante response was quiet but clear. Clothing exports decreased. Internal textile networks flourished. Local rulers began requiring traditional cloth at ceremonies and increased taxes on foreign garments. Kente and Adinkra weren't just clothing, they were now badges of sovereignty. In one village near Kumasi, elders passed a ruling no man could marry without presenting 2 bolts of locally woven cloth to the bride's family. The cloth had to bear approved patterns, each symbol vetted by the elders to ensure it carried appropriate meaning. Thus, cloth became regulation, ritual, and resistance all at once. By the close of the 1830s, war loomed between the British and Asante. The First Anglo-Asante War had already taken place in 1824, resulting in the death of British Governor Charles McCarthy. Tensions remained high. Trade was disrupted. Politics turned inward. And yet, the looms never stopped. Even as battle lines were drawn, cloth was being woven for peacetime, for birthrights, for funerals, for weddings, for the belief that even if the empire changed, the threads of identity would remain. It's at this moment that we meet an elderly weaver named Kwaku Mansa who had been working the looms for over 60 years. He had trained more than 20 apprentices, many of whom had left Kumasi in search of new lives. But Mensa remained, he said. You cannot build a palace without the rope that binds the wood. Kings change, walls crumble, but a pattern remains. His final piece, woven in the last year of his life, was titled Akoma no Aso, Unity of Hearts. It was gifted to a young weavers' guild starting in the village of Bonwire, east of Kumasi. That pattern is still known today. As your mind grows quieter and the evening deepens, imagine Kumasi lit by oil lamps and fireflies. A boy walks beside his mother, her robe softly brushing the earth. On it, a single repeated symbol, for while hardy, the sign of freedom. He cannot read, not yet, but he asks her what it means, and she answers, "It means we are still ourselves." Even when others forget, and as you drift towards sleep, you may wonder, what would our history look like if we studied the seams, the stitches, the symbols, as carefully as we study the swords, temples, taxes, and the rhythm of ordinary lives? As dawn broke over the ziggurat of Uruk, the early morning light slid across its terraced levels like a silent offering from the heavens. Below, in the waking city, the slow hum of life began. Cattle lowered, clay ovens crackled to life, and water carriers trudged toward the riverbanks. While much of Mesopotamian history is colored by kings and conquests, the story that unfolded here was not one of battle but one of ritual, record-keeping, and rhythmic labor. This final section draws together the slow-moving gears of Mesopotamian daily life, the bureaucratic spine that held society together, the spiritual duties that structured time, and the unglamorous but essential tasks that formed the invisible threads of an enduring civilization. To the casual modern reader, the temple in ancient Mesopotamia might evoke thoughts of divine communion or spiritual retreat. But for the ordinary inhabitant of your Uruk or Nipper, the temple was closer to what we might call an administrative hub or an economic engine. At the heart of this system was the ziggurat, a massive stepped structure topped with a shrine that honored the city's patron deity, be it Inanna in Uruk or Enlil in Nipper. Yet the base and outer structures surrounding the ziggurat were not made for prayer, but for work. Temples functioned as estates, owning large tracts of land and employing thousands of workers. Farmers planted barley in temple-owned fields. Herders tended temple sheep. Potters and weavers produced goods that bore the temple seal. The priesthood, far from being a cloistered class of mystics, managed detailed inventories. Ration lists, labor rosters, and produce logs were all inscribed on clay tablets, many of which survive to this day, documenting mundane exchanges. 3 liters of barley to ACL ox driver, 1 wool tunic to Admu laborer. What made this system particularly enduring was its structure of redistribution. Workers were paid in food and clothing meticulously measured. In a society without coined money, goods were counted in weight or volume, shekels of silver, liters of oil, baskets of grain. The temple thus stood not only as a house of worship, but as the central node of an economy fueled by scribes and silence. Every tunic, every brick, and every goat was part of a logistical ballet that required exactness, not enthusiasm. To feed the temple, and, by extension, the gods, Mesopotamian rulers imposed duties that were, in essence, a form of tax. These included iltum compulsory labor, bala rotational tribute, and grain levies collected from local landholders. These taxes weren't necessarily paid in silver, rather, in sacks of barley, bundles of reeds, jars of beer, or even manpower. Scribe, or dubsar, held enormous importance in this system. Their training began in tablet schools called editbar, where children memorized long lists of signs and practiced writing cuneiform on soft clay with a reed stylus. These young scribes would one day be entrusted with managing everything from warehouse stocks to land boundaries. Theirs was not a life of poetic creativity. It was repetition, precision, and long hours under the hot sun, balancing ledgers in the temple courtyard. It is telling that in ancient reliefs, kings are sometimes shown with a scribe beside them, holding a writing board. The written word held such authority that it could outlast memory and disputes. In a land where the river might shift course or a neighbor might claim your barley field, the clay tablet served as both witness and weapon. For common people, these scribes were both a lifeline and a looming presence. Without their documentation, a laborer might go unpaid, a delivery unacknowledged, a debt unrecorded, or worse, erased. And yet, the very existence of these tablets means that the once forgotten citizens of Mesopotamia, farmers, potters, dockworkers, have left behind echoes in baked clay. While daily life ticked by in labors and ledgers, it was interspersed with the calendar of the gods. The Mesopotamians, deeply attuned to cycles of the moon and stars, organized their year around agricultural and religious festivals. These events were not simply celebrations, they were public affirmations of cosmic order. Each major city had its sacred calendar, often revolving around the journey or marriage of their patron deity. In Uruk, for example, the sacred marriage festival Hyros Gamos reenacted the union of Inanna and Dumuzi, believed to ensure fertility and abundance for the coming season. Priests and priestesses enacted sacred dramas, and offerings were made, in abundance of sheep, beer, and breads shaped like animals. For the average citizen, these festivals provided not just spiritual participation, but also temporary relief from labor. Temples gave out extra rations, processions paraded through the streets, and the usual rhythm of toil was punctuated by song and sacrifice. But even in these moments, the logistics were exhausting. Someone had to feed the priests, wash the ceremonial vessels, tend the sacred fires, and guide the animals. These roles were not left to elites alone. Rotational labor pulled from the populace ensured that even the spiritual machinery of Mesopotamia was oiled by ordinary hands. In the end, what survives of Mesopotamia is not grand monuments. Many ziggurats have eroded, their bricks carted off by later generations, but humble, sun-baked clay. Over 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been unearthed, and each one holds a fragment of a world once bustling with quiet industry. They record love letters, school exercises, tax disputes, legal rulings, and even complaints about bad beer. One such tablet from the city of Nipper reads like a bitter Yelp review. The buyer of the innkeeper was not fresh. I gave silver, but the measure was short. Another, found in a scribal training center, features a teacher's correction. Your hand is lazy. Practice more. These glimpses reveal the most mundane truths of all, that people were people. They worried about their wages, grumbled about the weather, and clung to the familiar cycles of feast and famine, work and rest. The scribes could not have known that their simple inventories would one day be read under fluorescent lights in quiet museum archives, thousands of years after their cities fell to dust. But in that dusty silence, their words remain, not heroic, not poetic, just real. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Mesopotamian civilization was not its kings or wars, but its ability to systematize ordinary life. It organized labor, codified laws, built flood canals, and measured grain day after day, century after century. While empires rose and fell, and gods changed names and places, the quiet thud of a clay seal impressed onto a wet tablet echoed across generations. And so we are left to ask, was it the ziggurat or the barley silo that built Mesopotamia? The king's spear or the scribe's stylus? In the stillness of night, when history seems distant and abstract, the answer becomes oddly clear. It was the weight of the ordinary that held it all together. Story 3. The stone carvers of Lalibela, Ethiopia's rock-hewn churches chiseling faith into the mountains. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, some 2,500 meters above sea level, in the small and quiet town of Lalibela, time seems to slow, and sound echoes against the ancient rock walls of churches that were not built but carved. As you walk through the red volcanic rock, it almost feels like the ground itself rose up and shaped sanctuaries with arched windows, domes, and intricate carvings. There are no bricks, no mortar, just stone, carefully hollowed from the earth. Over 800 years ago, these rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, stand today not only as architectural marvels, but as enduring testaments to faith, devotion, and sheer human perseverance. The story of how they came to be is layered, quiet, and steeped in a deep sense of purpose. To understand the churches, you must first understand the king behind them, Giba Meskel Lalibela. King Lalibela ruled Ethiopia during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, a time when the Zagwe dynasty held sway. Unlike the larger-than-life kings of Western lore, Lalibela's reign was marked more by piety than power. He was known not for conquest or riches, but for his devotion to Christianity and his mission to turn Ethiopia into a symbolic New Jerusalem. To tradition, Lalibela was born in the town of Roha, which would later be renamed in his honor. His name, Lalibela, means the bees recognize his sovereignty. The story goes that shortly after his birth, a swarm of bees surrounded his cradle. Rather than stinging him, they gently hovered, a sign, it was said, of divine favor. His mother, seeing this omen, believed he was destined for greatness. But Lalibela's rise was not easy. He lived during a time of political tension and internal rivalry. It is believed that he spent years in exile, possibly in Jerusalem or nearby, gathering not only spiritual wisdom but also a vision. When he returned, he became king with a mission, to provide Ethiopian Christians with a holy city of their own, especially after Muslim forces had taken control of Jerusalem in 1187 under Saladin. This dream of a new Jerusalem took root in the volcanic rock of Roha, but Lalibela was not just thinking of symbolism. He sought to make these churches places of worship, pilgrimage, and spiritual retreat. The construction of 11 interconnected churches carved straight from the ground began, each hewn downward from a single piece of rock. Imagine the labor. Thousands of workers, possibly including skilled artisans, priests, and even local villagers, toiled using primitive tools, chisels, hammers, and picks made of iron. There was no blueprint, no scaffolding. The workers had to start at the top of the rock and chisel downward. A mistake couldn't be patched over with plaster. It was etched into stone forever. The churches were not scattered randomly. They were arranged in two main groups separated by a river named Jordanos, or Jordan, another symbolic reference to Jerusalem. There was Beit Medhain, Alem, House of the Savior of the World, believed to be the largest monolithic church in the world. Then Beit Mariam, House of Mary, considered one of the oldest and most finely decorated. Each church had its purpose, its dedication, and its place in the sacred geography. The layout was not only spiritual, it was practical. The churches were connected by a maze of tunnels, passageways, and trenches. In this cool subterranean world, one could walk from one church to another shielded from the harsh sun or from invading eyes. Some historians speculate that this underground network also had defensive advantages, though others believe it was mostly designed for sacred processions and symbolic pilgrimages. Religious devotion in Ethiopia at the time was deeply intertwined with the fabric of daily life. Orthodox Christianity had taken root there as early as the 4th century, making Ethiopia one of the first nations to adopt Christianity as a state religion. But this form of Christianity was distinctly closely tied to Judaic traditions, full of fasting rituals, ancient chants, and sacred manuscripts hand-copied by monks. Within the carved walls of Lalibela's churches, these traditions lived and breathed. Priests kept vigil, sacred relics were hidden in underground chambers, and rituals took place to the soft hum of the krawa, a lyre-like instrument, and the beat of the kaboro drum. Pilgrims walked barefoot, leaning on wooden staffs, kissing the ancient walls with reverence. The question that lingers, quietly and stubbornly, is how? How were such vast, precise, and structurally complex churches created with such limited technology? How did they manage the drainage, the ceilings, the acoustics, and how did they achieve such monumental work still standing centuries later with no written record of the engineering? Legends, of course, provide their own answers. One of the most persistent is that the churches were built with the help of angels. According to local tradition, human workers labored during the day, and at night, angels took over. These divine beings supposedly tripled the pace of construction, enabling the churches to be completed in just 24 years. Whether one sees this story as metaphor or miracle, it reflects the awe the churches inspired then and continue to inspire today. And so, we are left standing at the edge of the rock trench, staring down at Beit Georgis, the house of St. George, perhaps the most iconic of the churches. Shaped like a perfect Greek cross, and carved entirely from solid rock, it stands serene and silent, its walls rising from the earth as though grown rather than carved. There are no bricks, no seams, just solid stone, holding centuries of whispered prayers. But what happened to the people who built them? The stonemasons, the laborers, the priests who watched over the construction. Who were they, and how did they live? What kind of society sustained such a monumental project, and what happened to it after Lalibela's death? Of ovens, ink, and pumicestone pavements, you wake up again not in your bed, but in a cool stone room somewhere deep in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. It's the same town, the same dusty morning light, but today, you're not visiting the wines or greeting the baker. Today, you follow the lesser-known trail of laborers, scribes, and women bent over pots, tools, or wax tablets. The heartbeat of Pompeii was not only in its politics or pleasures, but in its rhythms of ordinary work. As the sun begins to warm the city, the first to stir are not senators or merchants. They are the cleaners, the apprentices, the enslaved, people who begin their day not with ceremony, but with water jars and brooms. The narrow alleys of Pompeii were swept by hand, often using rudimentary bundles of twigs tied with cord. These streets, made of irregularly placed stones, known today as basoli, were uneven but purposeful. The gaps between the stones allowed rainwater to trickle down or waste to be washed away toward the central drains. It was not glamorous, but it worked. And there, just past the temple of Jupiter. You might notice a curious routine, someone scattering crushed pumice across the smooth stone. You may have thought of pumice as something volcanic, and you'd be right, but to a Pompeian it was also a cleaning agent. Ground into fine dust, it could polish metal, absorb spills, and scour pots. Even women's cosmetics made use of it, mixed with vinegar or milk to exfoliate the skin. A gritty little miracle, born from the very volcano that would one day entomb them all. In a courtyard not far from the Forum Baths, an elderly woman begins her morning ritual. She pulls aside the linen curtain from her kitchen doorway, revealing a hearth with yesterday's ash still warm. Her work begins with simple repetition, rinsing lentils, kneading a stiff paste of barley and dried figs, stirring it all together with crushed coriander and salt. There's no olive oil today. It's too costly, but a dab of fermented fish sauce will suffice. Garum, pungent and ever-present, fills the air like smoke. It isn't appetizing to the modern nose, but to Pompeii's citizens, it was prized more precious than wine. In some houses, garum factories, tucked into the industrial quarters of the city, reeked of boiling fish guts and sun-dried entrails. But they were also economic engines, churning out earthenware amphorae packed with this ancient umami gold. You leave her behind, continuing along the cobbled paths where shop signs, frescoes painted directly on walls advertise their wares. A barber's pole, a donkey-shaped bread stamp, and even a crude sketch of a ship, each one a kind of ancient billboard. Many of the city's citizens were illiterate, and so symbols served as shorthand for services: a hammer for a smithy, a goblet for a tavern. One fresco even shows a dog on a chain, underneath which the famous warning cave, Cunum, beware of the dog, is painted in deep red letters. But it's not just a warning, it's branding. Somewhere behind one of these walls, you hear the unmistakable rhythm of tools at work, wood being shaved, bronze clinking, and in one corner, soft muttering. You're in the workshop of a scribe, not a writer in the modern sense, but a professional record keeper. His tools: a stylus and wax tablet, a reed, pen and a jar of ink made from soot and gum. The scribe dips his pen and scratches out the details of a grain shipment from Herculaneum. The parchment will be sealed with wax and tied with string, then stored in a clay jar, sometimes even labeled with a baked clay tag, an early version of the modern file cabinet. This man might never have met the grain merchant, but through this ink they are tied across time. Scribes didn't just deal in commerce, they wrote contracts, dictated poems, and transcribed recipes. One unearthed recipe found buried beneath the layers of ash describes a cake made of cheese, eggs, and honey, baked in leaves. Another lists remedies for indigestion, including boiled cabbage water and a paste made from crushed beetles. Whether these were effective or not remains a mystery, but they reflect the ordinary hopes of ordinary people, a desire to feel better, to taste something sweet, to survive. You make your way now toward the Phalonica, or laundry. It's not what you expect. In the center courtyard are large stone basins, troughs where clothes are trampled by foot in a mixture of water, ash and urine. Yes, urine. Its ammonia helped to clean and bleach the cloth. In fact, urine was so valuable that collection jars were placed on street corners for public contribution. The workers here are covered in splashes and soapsuds. A young boy dumps a bucket over a fresh pile of tunics. The smell is pungent, but the process is efficient. Once rinsed, the garments are hung from ropes stretched between beams, then brushed with clay to restore their softness. The same industry also served as a center for dyeing fabric. Colors like indigo and saffron were prized, but costly. Some fuller specialized in reds, made from crushed cochineal beetles, or purple extracted from shellfish. But for most citizens, tunics were dyed a soft off-white, and perhaps edged with colored thread to show status or profession. Beyond the launderers, near the quieter northern district, stands a tourum shop where women gather. This isn't a temple though, candles flicker by a household altar. It's a spinning and weaving house, one of many scattered throughout Pompeii. The work is repetitive, meditative. Wool is combed, twisted into thread, and spun into fabric using drop spindles and loom weights. You can hear the wooden looms creak and snap, their shuttle sticks clacking like bones. It's tedious work, often performed by enslaved women or young girls, yet the outcome: blankets, tunics, curtains shape daily life in quiet but critical ways. They sing as they work, soft hymns to Minerva, goddess of wisdom and craft. Their fingers are stained with dye, calloused from pulling threads, and yet they smile as they speak of markets and news. One of them whispers about the new mosaic floor in the Temple of Isis. Another mutters about a neighbor's sick cow. In these walls, the pulse of daily life is steady and subdued, and here lies a remarkable paradox. For all of Pompeii's art, for all its opulence in villas and frescoes, the backbone of its society was made up of workers like these men and women who turned wheat into bread, wool into tunics, fish into sauce, and parchment into preserved thought. You step again into the warm street, feeling the shift in light as midday approaches. A group of children passes by, playing with knuckle bones and chasing one another past a fountain. A marble spout burbles, water pooling into the stone basin where women fill their jugs. The water is cleanly piped from aqueducts into the city's castella acqui or reservoirs, but not all districts have equal access. Some homes use cisterns to collect rainwater, while wealthier homes boast private fountains and intricate plumbing, a stark reminder of the city's social hierarchy. Built into its very infrastructure. At the edge of the street, just before a corner, you see a curious sight. A man kneels near a pothole in the paving stones. He is a road repairman. His tools are simple: crushed brick, mortar, and fresh basalt slabs. As carts clatter by, he patiently chisels and shapes a new stone into place. No one thanks him, no one stops. But centuries later, archaeologists will marvel at his handiwork, at the roads that remained walkable beneath 10 feet of ash. And you pause here, on the edge of the square, realizing something curious. Though we remember Pompeii for its sudden end, the city thrived for hundreds of years in these unnoticed moments. These people were not waiting to be frozen in time. They were living each day shaped by quiet labor, repetitive tasks, and small satisfactions. But even as the city bustled, subtle signs began to emerge. A small tremor in the ground, a crack in a fountain wall, animals behaving oddly. Few paid it any mind. Why would they? The mountain had been there for generations, a silent companion to their daily routines. And yet, even now, you might wonder, did they sense something deep beneath the pebbles? The twilight of guild power. By the close of the 17th century, Lübeck was no longer the uncontested titan it had once been. The Hanseatic League's disintegration was not abrupt. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, like a garment left too long in the rain. As trade routes shifted, the rise of Atlantic powers like England and the Netherlands redirected the currents of commerce away from the Baltic Sea and into the open Atlantic. Lübeck's harbors grew quieter. The steady rhythm of guild halls, emptying at dusk, lost its urgency. But it was during this gradual fading that the Lübeck guilds faced their most defining, if not dramatic, transformation. While Lübeck's economy was in decline, the guilds themselves remained robust institutions. Of tradition, their rules were strict, their ceremonies unyielding, and their hierarchy unmoved by time. But this very resistance to change, once a source of strength, had become a burden. Younger craftsmen, trained in new methods and eager to innovate, found themselves stifled under the heavy weight of guild regulation. Tools were standardized, apprenticeships stretched over a decade, and innovation frowned upon unless approved by a master who had often not touched a forge in years. It was not simply a matter of economics. The spirit of Europe was shifting. Enlightenment, ideas about individual rights, free markets, and the virtues of merit over lineage had begun to filter into even the quieter corners of the German states. In Lübeck, a young tanner named Jakob Refelt represents the new wind that was blowing through the narrow alleyways of the old merchant town. Jakob had been apprenticed to a guildmaster who taught the old way of treating leather, a method using fish oils and bark tinctures that gave a soft, if sometimes pungent, finish. But Jakob had traveled to Denmark, where he encountered a newer, less odorous method that made hides more durable and resistant to water, an asset for northern Europe's damp climate. Eager to bring this back home, he asked his guildmaster for permission to implement it. The request was denied. Jakob was undeterred. He opened a small backroom workshop and began using his new methods, quietly building a loyal clientele among fishermen and dock. Before long, whispers of his superior leather spread beyond Lübeck's walls, and just as quickly, the Tanners Guild took action. Jakob was fined, publicly reprimanded, and banned from practicing unless he adhered to guild standards. A brief court battle ensued. Not a legal court, but the guild tribunal, an internal system that had governed trades for centuries. Jakob lost, but his story did not fade. In fact, it ignited a quiet movement. Other young artisans, particularly in textiles and metalwork, began pressing the guilds for reform. Some left Lübeck altogether, heading west toward Hamburg or south toward the Rhine, where less restrictive economic policies welcomed innovation, the city began to lose not only money but its youth and its future. There were, of course, internal efforts to reform. By the mid-1700s, a handful of guilds, particularly the carpenters and shoemakers, attempted to shorten apprenticeship terms and allow more flexibility in tool use. But these measures came too late. The merchant elite, who once sat comfortably atop the Hanseatic model, were now being eclipsed by banking families and industrial investors. Outside forces, too, played their role. Napoleon's expansion across Europe in the early 1800s led to the temporary dissolution of many guilds. The French, bringing with them a preference for free trade and a centralized economy, dismantled what they saw as outdated feudal remnants. The occupation of Lubeck from 1806 to 1813 introduced a new civic code. Guild charters were reviewed, some abolished, and others merged. When the French finally withdrew, the old guilds attempted to restore themselves, but the spell had been broken. And yet, the story does not end in destruction. Instead, like many aspects of European tradition, the guilds of Lubeck adapted, not in power, but in purpose. By the middle of the 19th century, they transformed into trade associations, no longer wielding exclusive rights over a profession, but rather serving as forums for advocacy, training, and community among craftsmen. The Blacksmiths Guild, for example, helped build an industrial training school, and the Brewers Guild invested in hygiene research during the cholera outbreaks of the 1860s. The stone guild halls still stood, now home to cultural centers, or archives. Their detailed facades, grinning gargoyles, saints holding tools, lions guarding lintels, became quiet witnesses to the passage of time. The traditions, too, lived on in annual festivals, old uniforms paraded once a year, and rituals reenacted more for memory than for regulation. Enya Cobra fell. His descendants became respected merchants, later opening a shoe factory that supplied the Prussian army in the Franco-Prussian War. A small plaque commemorates him today, not for his leather or lawsuits, but for challenging the old ways at a moment when Lubeck needed new direction. Perhaps this is the lesson the Lubeck guilds leave behind, not that they fell, but that they changed form. From rulers of commerce to keepers of memory, from regulators of labor to guardians of tradition. And so, the city that once dictated the tempo of Baltic trade, now sits quietly beneath spired churches and cobbled lanes, whispering its stories to anyone who lingers long enough to listen. But one cannot help but ask, had the guilds been quicker to adapt, had they loosened their grip just enough to let innovation breathe, would Lubeck still shine as the jewel of Northern Europe? Or was their downfall, like so many in history, not a failure, but a transformation masked in decline? Story 4. The mud and stones of medieval roads. Road through the muck, daily life on the highways of medieval Europe. You might not think much of a road. Today, you step onto asphalt, smooth, marked with paint, maintained with machines. But rewind to the 12th century, and a road might mean something very different. More than a physical path, it was a social artery laden with mud, dust, manure, thieves, and the slow churn of ox carts. In this section, we walk with the medieval traveler, and we do not hurry, for the journey was never the quick part. Let's begin not with knights and castles, but with something far more ordinary, the earth beneath your feet. The typical road in medieval Europe was not paved. Most were little more than rutted tracks formed by years of foot traffic, carts, and livestock. A village road was just a worn depression between hedgerows or stone walls. Sometimes it was reinforced with logs laid across it in a makeshift corduroy pattern to keep carts from sinking into the mud. But more often, it was at the mercy of the seasons. When it rained, which it often did in Northern Europe, especially in England and the Low Countries, the roads turned to thick mud, sucking at boots and wheels alike. In summer, they dried into hard ridges and ditches that jarred bones and broke wagon axles. Roads were never just there. They were maintained, though barely, by local peasants under feudal obligation. Each village was assigned responsibility for the upkeep of the segment of road within its bounds. This was known as statute labor, and usually occurred a few days a year during spring or after floods. If you were a peasant, you might be told by the local lord to bring your shovel and cart and work alongside neighbors, piling stones into holes or clearing fallen trees. There were no engineers, no drainage systems, just generations of trial and error and the occasional wooden plank for the worst spots. The idea of a highway also meant something different. The word itself, highway, referred to a path, raised above the surrounding land, usually just a few inches, meant to keep it out of the marshes. These were the major routes connecting towns and cities. But don't let that grand title fool you. Most highways were still dirt roads, maybe with some packed gravel if the local lord was particularly ambitious or rich. Only in some areas of Italy, southern France, and the remnants of Roman Britain would you find true stone-paved roads, and even those were often in disrepair, broken by time and weather. Now, imagine you're a traveller in 1280, you're leaving the market town of Winchester in southern England to reach Canterbury, about 130 miles to the east. You're not riding a fast horse. Those were luxuries for messengers or nobles. You have a cart, pulled by oxen. They move slowly, about 2 miles an hour, and they don't like long days. You hope to make 10 or 12 miles a day if the weather holds. Each morning, you wake to mist, perhaps frost in the autumn. You pack your few belongings, feed your animals, and begin. The road ahead is narrow, no more than 6 or 8 feet wide in many places. If someone comes from the other direction, one of you will have to yield into the brush. If it has rained, you must pick your steps carefully. A misstep can leave you ankle-deep in mud. Along the way, you'll see hedgerows and the occasional wooden signpost, though most roads had no signs at all. Travelers navigated by memory, the position of the sun, or by asking directions from passing shepherds. You'll pass through Yes, medieval roads often came with fees. These pavage tolls were collected to pay for the repair of roads or bridges, though they were also a source of profit for the local lord. A wooden gate blocked the road, and a keeper might demand a few pence to let you pass. If you refused, your journey stopped there or continued through the woods. If you dared. Speaking of woods, they were no small matter. The forests that bordered many roads were not scenic landscapes. They were places of danger. Bandits, runaways, and even wolves in some regions lurked there. Travelers rarely went alone unless they had no choice. Merchants often grouped together in informal caravans for safety. You might spend the night at an inn if you were lucky or if you could afford it. More often, you stayed in a stable, or even slept by your cart with a cloak around your shoulders. Were also travelers' hostels set up by monasteries and churches, especially along pilgrim routes. These were often Spartan but offered a bowl of pottage, a warm place to sleep, and protection under the church's watchful eye. The people you met on the road were as varied as the roads themselves. Wandering minstrels, peddlers with wares, monks traveling to another abbey, messengers carrying scrolls, pilgrims heading to a holy shrine, and peasants moving for seasonal labor. The road was a place of brief encounters, of shared stories by the fire and the constant crunch of feet on gravel. And yet, as uncomfortable as travel was, it shaped medieval society. The road was the thread that stitched the village to the manor, the town to the abbey, and the kingdom to its neighbors. Without it, ideas would not have spread. Cloth from Flanders, wine from Gascony, salt from the coastal pans all flowed through. Muddy tracks and timber bridges. News, gossip, and rumors of war spread one muddy bootstep at a time. Let's not forget the postal riders of royal courts and bishops' messengers. They carried more than just letters. They carried the functioning of a state. These riders had special permission to use horses from monasteries and manors, part of an informal postal relay that predated modern mail by centuries. Their paths were faster, but not without hardship. An urgent message might take 5 days from London to York, assuming the rivers didn't flood and the roads didn't collapse. Speaking of rivers, ferries were often more reliable than bridges. Where bridges did exist, they were wooden, prone to rot and collapse. Stone bridges, such as the famed medieval London Bridge, were rare feats of engineering and often paid for by religious orders or wealthy patrons. Most people simply waited for the boatman. So what made a journey bearable? Routine, familiarity, the knowledge that after 5 miles there'd be a crossroads tree where others left coins for luck, that a certain shrine was coming up where candles were always lit, that the tollkeeper at Eastbridge liked boiled eggs and might lower the fee for a kind word. The road was not fast, not clean, not comfortable, but it was constant, always waiting, always winding, always dragging carts, boots, hooves, and lives through the churn of the century. And so, the question lingers, how did societies thrive? Trade, war, pilgrimage on roads that today wouldn't qualify as driveways. In the next section, we'll follow the builders, toll collectors, and the rise of formal road guilds, as the idea of maintaining roads shifts from obligation to organized responsibility. The keepers of the way, road maintenance, toll collectors, and the birth of road guilds. After a long day navigating the muddy ruts and uneven surfaces of medieval roads, You might think that anyone, would be responsible for making these paths smoother, safer, and more reliable. But in medieval Europe, the reality was less straightforward than the idea of a central authority or state department managing public infrastructure. In this section, we delve into the overlooked individuals and groups who kept the wheels turning, the village laborers who struggled through the mud with shovels, the toll-keepers who guarded the narrow gateways, and the emerging guilds and confraternities that began to formalize road maintenance. For most villagers, road upkeep was a communal burden tied directly to feudal law. The statute labor system mandated that able-bodied peasants contribute time, tools, and labor to repair roads and bridges within their jurisdiction. It was not paid work, and it was often unpopular. Imagine the scene in springtime, when the rains had swollen the ditches and churned the surfaces into quagmires. A local lord or reeve might issue a call to arms, not with weapons, but with spades and pickaxes. Groups of villagers gathered, sometimes grumbling, sometimes resigned, to fill potholes with stones scavenged from nearby fields or riverbeds. Sometimes, logs were laid perpendicular to the road to create a corduroy effect, an uneven but effective way to keep carts from sinking too deep. This system worked on a patchwork basis. Some communities had better soils or easier access to stone, and their roads fared better. Others suffered chronic floods, making their sections nearly impassable for months at a time. The lack of standardized engineering knowledge meant roads often suffered from poor drainage, ditches clogged with debris, banks eroded, and wooden bridges rotted. Some lords took their responsibility more seriously than others, commissioning repairs or using revenues from their estates to improve critical routes. But for most peasants, working on the road was yet another form of feudal obligation, time spent away from tending crops or livestock, food stores dwindling, and backs aching under heavy loads. Toll collection was an integral, if unpopular, feature of medieval road life. Toll gates, sometimes simple wooden barriers, sometimes stone booths, stood at key points: city gates, river crossings, mountain passes. These gates were manned by toll keepers, who charged fees for the right to pass. Tolls were levied on people, animals, carts, and goods. The fees could vary widely depending on local law and the value of what was being transported. A merchant cart laden with cloth might pay more than a peasant walking with a basket of vegetables. Far from being merely obstacles, tolls were vital sources of revenue, funding not only road and bridge repairs, but also fortifications and local lordships. In many regions, toll rights were sold or granted by monarchs as privileges, sometimes auctioned off to wealthy individuals who saw tolls as lucrative investments. For the traveler, the toll was a small but inevitable annoyance. Those unable or unwilling to pay faced being turned back or forced to take dangerous detours. Corruption sometimes crept in. Toll keepers occasionally demanded extra fees or confiscated goods. Complaints about toll abuses appear frequently in medieval records and petitions. The operation of toll gates also reflected the emerging complexity of medieval administration. Often, a clerk recorded the names, origin, and cargo of merchants passing through, creating an early form of customs inspection. These records provide historians with valuable data about trade routes and commodities, even if the travelers at the time found the process tedious. As trade expanded in the later Middle Ages, especially in burgeoning cities, a new phenomenon appeared: the formation of road guilds and confraternities. Unlike the informal village labor groups, these guilds were more organized, sometimes semi-autonomous bodies tasked with overseeing specific stretches of road or trade routes. One of the earliest examples was the Guild of the Road in England, established by royal charter in the 13th century. This guild comprised local merchants, landowners, and craftsmen who pooled resources to maintain key roads, bridges, and way stations along their trade routes. They hired skilled laborers, built causeways, and even commissioned surveys to improve drainage. Similar guilds appeared in Germany and the Low Countries, especially around trading hubs like Lübeck and Bruges. These organizations served dual purposes: protecting and improving the roads that sustained commerce, and regulating the passage of goods and merchants. They often set standards for toll collection, established rules for wagon weights, and settled disputes between traders. The power of these guilds was both economic and political. They acted as intermediaries between monarchs, lords, and local communities, lobbying for privileges or exemptions. In some cases, they were responsible for security, organizing armed escorts or patrols against bandits. Their members also shared knowledge about road conditions, weather patterns, and market prices. effectively creating an early network of logistical intelligence. While roads were often primitive, bridges were the real infrastructure challenges. Crossing rivers, marshes, or ravines required engineering skills and materials that were expensive and scarce. Wooden bridges were common but vulnerable to floods, fires, and rot. Stone bridges were costly, required skilled masons, and could take years to complete in some cities. Religious orders took the initiative to fund bridge building, viewing it as an act of piety and public service. The famous London Bridge, built beginning in the 12th century, was both a roadway and a fortified gate. It was lined with shops and houses, making it a bustling hub, but also a precarious bottleneck. Bridges served as toll points, just like gates, and were sites of dispute when competing lords or towns claimed rights to collect fees. Maintenance of these structures was often a communal affair, with local authorities assigning labor or funds. When bridges failed, entire trade routes could be disrupted, forcing merchants to seek dangerous fords or lengthy detours. Travelers needed places to rest, eat, and stable their animals. Along major routes, especially pilgrim trails like the Camino de Santiago, waystations and inns sprang up. These establishments ranged from modest alehouses to well-run monasteries offering hospitality. Inns were often located at crossroads or near toll gates, making them convenient for merchants and travelers waiting for clearance. They were hubs of information exchange and social interaction. Sometimes, they served as unofficial marketplaces, where local farmers sold produce or craftspeople showcased goods. The quality of inns varied greatly. Some were clean and safe, others cramped and rife with thieves. Travelers learned to be cautious, to inspect the stables, and to guard their goods. The possibility of highwaymen lurking in woods or along isolated stretches made night travel perilous. Monastic hospitality was another key element. Many abbeys and priories offered shelter to pilgrims and poor travelers, providing food and shelter as acts of Christian charity. These institutions often maintained their own small roads or causeways leading to their lands, contributing to local infrastructure. Despite these efforts, the medieval road system faced constant challenges. The weather, especially in northern Europe, played a major role in degrading roads. Floods washed away ditches and foundations. Winters froze surfaces and made travel impossible. Banditry was an ever-present threat. Political instability, wars, and weak law enforcement allowed gangs to operate, particularly in forested areas and border regions. Towns sometimes hired guards or armed escorts to protect trade caravans. Additionally, the overlapping jurisdictions of feudal lords, cities, and the church often complicated maintenance and toll collection. Roads crossing multiple domains could be neglected, or tolls multiplied, discouraging travel. Disputes over rights of passage were frequent, leading to drawn-out legal battles. Even with these difficulties, medieval roads were critical arteries of social, economic, and cultural life. They connected distant villages to markets, enabled pilgrimage and crusade, allowed armies to mobilize, and facilitated the spread of ideas. Their condition directly influenced trade patterns. Merchants preferred safer, better-maintained routes, even if longer. Some cities flourished because they were hubs on multiple trade roads. Others declined when routes shifted. Moreover, roads shaped community rhythms. Market days, fairs, and festivals depended on accessible routes. Seasonal migrations, both of people and livestock, followed these ancient tracks. The constant movement fostered a slow but steady mixing of cultures and knowledge that, as you stand now, imagining the muddy, rutted roads of medieval Europe, you see that they were far more than dirt and stones. They were social spaces, economic lifelines, and the canvas on which countless ordinary lives played out struggles, hopes, and routine labor woven into the fabric of daily existence. Yet questions remain. How did the slow progress in improving these roads affect medieval economies over the long term? Were the guilds and communities able to keep pace with the expanding demands of trade and travel? And how did the road networks evolve as Europe approached the dawn of the modern age? From dirt to stone, the evolution and legacy of medieval roadways. As the centuries marched forward, the muddy, rutted roads of medieval Europe began a slow, uneven transformation. This final section traces that gradual evolution, how the forces of commerce, politics, and technology converged to reshape the pathways that bound the continent together, and what these changes meant for the people who depended on them. If you could stand once again on a typical 14th century road, your feet sinking into mud and gravel, you might scarcely imagine that within a few hundred years, much of Europe's travel network would be dramatically improved. But the shift was neither sudden nor uniform. Roads remained a patchwork of condition and construction, reflecting local resources, political will, and emerging technologies. The most visible change in road construction was the increased use of stone paving. The great Roman roads, legendary for their durability and design, had mostly fallen into ruin by the early Middle Ages, yet their remains provided models and sometimes materials for rebuilding. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, wealthier cities and important trade routes invested in cobblestone or flagstone paving. These surfaces, while uneven and noisy, were far more durable and kept carts from sinking into mud during wet seasons. The labor to quarry, transport, and lay stones was enormous and expensive, so paving remained confined to major urban centers, city streets, and some main routes connecting market towns. In northern Italy, cities such as Venice, Milan, and Florence pioneered extensive paving projects during the 14th and 15th centuries. In England, notable roads around London and Canterbury saw similar investments, often funded by toll revenues or by wealthy patrons seeking prestige and economic benefit. These stone roads also transformed urban life. Markets could operate year-round, without interruption from floods. Goods were transported with less damage, and travel times, though still slow by modern standards, became more predictable. Stone paving, however, was not without drawbacks. The noise of iron-shod wheels on cobbles could be deafening, and the uneven surface was hard on horses, hooves, and people's feet alike. The financial burden of road maintenance remained a problem well into the early modern era. Statute labor and guild oversight were often insufficient, and roads quickly degraded after heavy rains or winter frost. The solution came in the form of turnpike trusts. Beginning in the 17th century in England and spreading through Europe, these were organizations authorized by the government to collect tolls specifically earmarked for road improvement and upkeep. Turnpike trusts could borrow money, contract laborers, and systematically improve roads by leveling, draining, and surfacing them. The arrival of turnpikes marked a turning point in road history. The shift from patchwork, locally maintained routes to more standardized, managed thoroughfares. Travelers still paid tolls, but with the benefit of smoother, more reliable passage. This development was not without controversy. Toll gates were sometimes seen as burdensome or corrupt, and some rural communities protested their introduction. Nevertheless, turnpikes gradually spread, especially along busy trade routes and routes connecting industrializing towns. Alongside institutional changes, the rise of engineering knowledge played a critical role in improving roads. Figures like John Metcalfe, known as Blind Jack of Roseborough, who despite his blindness designed and constructed some of England's first modern roads in the mid-18th century, pioneered new methods of drainage, grading, and stone layering. Thomas Telford and John Macadam later built on this legacy. Macadam's method, macadamization, involved laying and compacting layers of small, angular stones, creating a hard, smooth surface that drained well and was easier to maintain. This technique revolutionized road building, influencing road construction worldwide. Though these engineers lived centuries after the medieval period, their innovations were the culmination of gradual advancements beginning in those earliest muddy ruts. The medieval efforts in road maintenance, toll collection, and communal responsibility provided the framework upon which later, more systematic infrastructure development was built. Better roads had far-reaching effects on medieval and early modern Europe. Trade expanded, connecting regions that had once been isolated by poor travel conditions. Merchants could transport goods faster and in better condition, increasing profits and encouraging specialization. This also facilitated the rise of market towns and the gradual decline of isolated feudal economies. Cities grew as trade hubs, and rural producers found new opportunities to sell surplus produce or crafts. Moreover, improved roads supported the movement of armies and officials, enabling central authorities to exert greater control over distant territories. Pilgrimage routes flourished, and the flow of ideas, news, books, political thoughts accelerated. Yet, despite improvements, travel remained arduous for most. Journeys that today take hours could still take days or weeks. Roads outside main arteries were often little better than tracks, and seasonal conditions continued to challenge travelers. Amid these broad transformations, the human stories persisted. Tollkeepers, once simple gate watchers, became salaried employees of trusts, balancing hospitality with vigilance. Innkeepers expanded establishments to accommodate increased traffic, creating social hubs that would become centers of news and community. Merchants and pilgrims still faced hazards: weather, bandits, illness, and fatigue. The improvements in roads lessened some risks, but introduced others, like crowded routes and the rising cost of tolls. Peasants, too, felt the changes, sometimes losing traditional rights to work on roads, sometimes gaining from better access to markets and towns. Today, beneath modern highways and railways, many medieval roads still survive in alignment and function. The medieval grid of routes shaped the economic and cultural geography of Europe, echoing in place names, parish boundaries, and even traffic patterns. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of stone, timber, and clay that reveal the ingenuity and toil of generations of road builders and maintainers. Their work, often overlooked, was essential to the slow but steady progress of medieval society. As you settle into quiet reflection, consider the muddy, uneven, and often frustrating roads that carried so many before the age of asphalt. They were more than just tracks. They were the veins of medieval life, connecting people, goods, and ideas against the persistent challenges of nature and politics. And the question remains for us today: how often do we pause to appreciate the ordinary labor and slow innovation behind the roads we take for granted, roads that have carried humanity forward, one step, one wheel, and one stone at a time? Story 5. The silent scripts of medieval scribes. The monks behind the manuscripts, a world written by hand. Imagine a time before printers, typewriters, or computers, a world where every book, letter, and record was written painstakingly by hand. This was the medieval age of the scribe, a profession as vital as it was tedious. The silent scripts produced in dimly lit monasteries and scriptoriums formed the backbone of knowledge, law, and religion for centuries. Yet, the daily life of these scribes remains a quiet story, often overshadowed by grand events and famous figures. In this section, we step inside the scriptorium, the workshop where words were born letter by letter, page by page, and explore the methods, routines, and struggles of the medieval scribes who shaped the written world. The scriptorium was rarely a grand hall. More often it was a modest room within a monastery, cloistered away from the hustle of the outside world. Long wooden tables lined with benches, a faint scent of parchment and ink, and windows that admitted just enough light for the scribes to work, but not so much as to fade the delicate inks. The monks who worked here came from various backgrounds. Some were educated from youth, destined for religious life. Others were recruited later due to steady handwriting or patience. A scribe's tools were simple but precious: quills cut from goose or swan feathers, ink made from iron gall or soot, mixed with gum, arabic, and parchment crafted painstakingly from animal skins. Before any writing began, the parchment had to be prepared, cleaned, stretched, and ruled with faint lines to guide the hand. This preparation was often done by novices or assistants, freeing the scribes to focus on the delicate work of copying texts. The texts themselves ranged widely: religious scriptures like the Bible and Psalms, legal codes, histories, medical treatises, and philosophical works. Each book was copied word for word, a process requiring immense concentration and humility. Mistakes could be costly, both in wasted materials and spiritual discipline. Monks often worked in silence, the only sounds a faint scratching of quill against parchment and occasional whispered prayers. The pace was slow, perhaps a few lines per hour. The lighting was dim, limited to natural daylight and sometimes flickering candles or oil lamps, which risked blotting the pages or causing fire. Some scribes specialized further as adding intricate decorations and miniature paintings in vibrant colors, gold leaf, and silver. These illuminated manuscripts remain among the most exquisite surviving artifacts of the Middle Ages. Time was marked not in hours, but by religious observances. The day was divided into prayers, meals, and work. Writing was considered both a spiritual act and a laborious craft. A scribe's diligence was thought to honor God, preserving sacred texts and spreading Christian teachings. But life as a scribe was not without hardship. Physical strain was common: back pain from long hours seated, eye strain from poor lighting, and occasional injuries from repeated quill cutting or ink exposure. Monks sometimes complained of the monotonous work, the endless repetition of words, and the isolation. Furthermore, errors could lead to harsh consequences. A misspelled word in scripture was a serious offense. Scribes faced reprimands or were assigned additional penance. Accuracy was paramount, yet their work was essential. Without scribes, knowledge would have been lost, laws forgotten, and religious traditions broken. Manuscripts copied by these humble men traveled far and wide, connecting monasteries, courts, and universities across Europe. As you close your eyes and imagine the scratch of quills and the scent of old parchment, you might wonder, how did scribes balance devotion with drudgery? How did they cope with the isolation and relentless precision demanded by their craft? And what innovations, if any, slowly changed their world before the printing press transformed it forever? The tools, trials, and traditions of the scriptorium. As dawn filters softly through narrow monastery windows, the scriptorium begins to stir. The quiet hum of preparation signals the continuation of a centuries-old ritual, the slow, deliberate crafting of texts by hand. In the previous section, we stepped into this world to meet the monks who devoted themselves to the painstaking work of copying manuscripts. Now, we delve deeper, examining the physical tools, the challenges they faced, and the evolving traditions that defined their craft. At first glance, the scribes' tools seem deceptively simple: quills, ink, parchment, and knives. Yet behind this apparent simplicity lay a complex interplay of materials, skills, and processes that shaped the very survival of knowledge. Quills were the scribe's primary instrument, usually fashioned from goose feathers. The preparation of a quill was a careful art. The shaft was hardened by heating it over embers, then cut precisely to form a nib sharp enough to inscribe delicate letters, but flexible enough to allow control. The angle and shape of this nib determined the thickness and style of the script. Some scribes preferred swan or crow feathers for their sturdiness or availability. Every few lines, the quill had to be trimmed with a small penknife to maintain its sharpness. This meant scribes carried knives constantly and had to develop dexterity and care lest a slip mar the page or injure a finger. Ink was no less critical. The standard ink, iron gall ink, was made by mixing tannin-rich oak galls with iron salts and a binder like gum arabic. This produced a rich, deep black that, when dried, became nearly permanent. However, iron gall ink was acidic and could, over centuries, erode the parchment if applied too thickly or carelessly. Other inks, made from soot or plant dyes, added color but lacked permanence. Ink preparation was often the task of specialized monks, and the quality varied from monastery to monastery. A poor batch could smear or fade quickly, ruining hours of careful work. Parchment, prepared animal skins were both expensive and delicate. Skins of calves, vellum, sheep, or goats were cleaned, stretched on frames, scraped to thinness, and rubbed smooth. Imperfections had to be carefully managed. Holes or scars might be patched or incorporated into the text layout. The cost of parchment meant mistakes were costly. Before writing, faint guidelines were ruled on the parchment using a stylus or lead point, ensuring uniformity in line, height, and margin. These lines were often erased or barely visible in the finished manuscript. Monastic life was governed by the canonical hours, designated times for prayer, work, and rest. The scriptorium's schedule intertwined with this rhythm. Work began after morning prayers and typically lasted several hours, before the midday meal. During these sessions, silence was strictly observed, broken only by the rustle of pages, the scratch of quills, and whispered prayers. Monks worked seated on wooden benches, often bent over their desks for hours, eyes fixed on the parchment. The physical toll was significant. Poor posture and inadequate lighting caused headaches and musculoskeletal pain. Eye strain was exacerbated by the flickering of candles during darker months. Some monks developed blurred vision or even blindness, occupational hazards rarely acknowledged, yet the work demanded both precision and patience. Copying involved more than tracing letters. Scribes had to understand their source texts to avoid errors. They corrected mistakes by scraping off ink with a knife and smoothing the parchment again, but extensive errors could require discarding a page. Beyond copying, scribes sometimes compiled texts, added glosses or annotations, or created indexes. This was not mechanical labor but intellectual engagement. Some monks specialized as illustrators, adding colorful illustrations, decorated initials, and gold leaf to manuscripts. This art elevated books beyond utilitarian objects into treasures of devotion and prestige. Illuminations followed strict conventions. Religious scenes, floral motifs, and geometric patterns adorned margins and chapter headings. Gold leaf thin sheets of hammered gold were applied with glue, catching candlelight to dazzle readers. The process was delicate and layered. A base drawing was made in lead or charcoal, followed by the application of pigments derived from minerals, plants, and insects. Glue came from lapis lazuli, red from cinnabar, green from verdigris. Each color required separate preparation and careful layering. Illumination was expensive and time-consuming, often reserved for important texts like gospel, books or yet these vibrant editions helped transmit stories and teachings to an often illiterate audience, using images as a form of communication. Beyond physical strain and material demands, scribes faced spiritual and social challenges. Errors could be viewed as moral failings. The discipline of the scriptorium included not only work but reflection, humility, and the acceptance of toil as a form of penance. Monasteries valued silence and obedience. The repetitive nature of copying texts was seen as a meditative practice, a way to focus the mind and honor God. Yet boredom and isolation could weigh heavily. Some monks found relief in copying poetry or chronicles, though most manuscripts were religious or legal in nature. The profession was also hierarchical. Senior scribes supervised novices and apprentices, who learned through imitation and correction. Skill and speed were prized, but so was piety. Despite its ancient roots, the scriptorium was not static. From the 12th century onward, the rise of universities and increased demand for books spurred innovations. The development of more standardized scripts like the Gothic textualis made writing faster and more legible. The introduction of paper from the Islamic world in the 13th century provided a cheaper, more abundant alternative to parchment. Though its adoption was gradual, urban scriptoria emerged outside monasteries, run by secular clerks and professional scribes who served growing bureaucracies and wealthy patrons. These workshops sometimes hired lay scribes, expanding access to literacy and written culture. Nevertheless, the scriptorium remained bound by tradition and labor-intensive methods, until a technological revolution loomed on the horizon. As you imagine the flickering candlelight illuminating manuscripts still wet with ink, the faint scent of vellum, and the soft rustle of turning pages, consider this. Centuries of human knowledge, law, and faith were preserved not by machines or printing presses, but by the quiet hands of scribes who wrote, erased, and rewrote the very fabric of history. What did it mean for knowledge to be so fragile, bound to the health, skill, and time of a few dedicated individuals? How did this affect what was copied, who had access, and what knowledge was lost forever? These questions remain as open as the manuscripts themselves. The end of the manuscript era and the dawn of print. After centuries of patient labor, the era of the medieval scribe drew to a close, swept away by the whirlwind of technological innovation. Yet the legacy of those quiet rooms and the monks' steady hands remains deeply embedded in the cultural, intellectual, and artistic history of Europe. In this section, we explore the twilight of manuscript culture, the profound impact of the printing press, and the enduring echoes of the scribes' work in modern times. The invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century marked a seismic shift. Suddenly, books could be produced rapidly, in large quantities, and with consistent quality. This innovation democratized access to knowledge, breaking the monopoly held by monasteries and secular scriptoria. But this transformation was neither immediate nor universal. Printing presses were expensive, and early printed books, known as incunabula, often mimicked the look of manuscripts, with decorative initials and typefaces designed to resemble handwritten scripts. Printers hired scribes and illuminators to add finishing touches, illustrating the continuity between old and new. For the monks, the printing press posed a challenge to their traditional roles. Some monasteries embraced the new technology, establishing presses of their own, while others saw it as a threat to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. The transition from manuscript to print inevitably led to the disappearance of many scribes' tasks, yet the meticulous care with which medieval manuscripts were produced ensured their survival. Thousands remain today in libraries and collections worldwide, treasured as art objects, historical records, and windows into medieval life. The preservation of manuscripts was a slow process. Many were lost to war, neglect, fire, or simple decay. Others were recycled parchment, scraped clean, and reused in a process called palimpsesting. Still, those that survive testify to the scribe's skill and the cultural value placed on their work. Interestingly, some of the earliest printed books have survived precisely because they copied or preserved manuscripts that no longer exist. Thus, the printing press became both a successor and a guardian of the scribal tradition. Before the printing press, literacy was rare, and books scarce. The scribes shaped not only what was written, but also who could read and learn. Scriptoria often copied religious texts for internal use, limiting access largely to clergy and elite scholars. However, the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries expanded the demand for books, especially legal and philosophical texts. This fueled a growing market for secular scriptoria, which produced texts for lay scholars, nobility, and eventually merchants. Scribes influenced literacy not just through copying but by standardizing texts. Their efforts preserved classical works, church doctrines, and legal codes. In doing so, they created a foundation for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Modern readers often forget the human labor and artistry behind medieval manuscripts. Each letter was the result of hours of painstaking effort. Each decorative flourish required steady hands and artistic skill. Manuscripts varied widely from simple utilitarian copies to lavishly illuminated masterpieces. This human touch gave manuscripts a unique character. Slight variations in handwriting, marginal notes, corrections, and even doodles offer glimpses into the minds and personalities of the scribes. Moreover, the collaborative nature of manuscript production, where scribes, illuminators, binders, and patrons interacted, created books that were more than information carriers. They were cultural artifacts, embodying faith, power, and community. As you reflect on the slow, repetitive labor of the medieval scribe, it's worth pondering how much of our modern information culture still depends on human patience and care. In an age of digital text and instant communication, the deliberate act of writing by hand may seem quaint or obsolete. Yet the scribe's world reminds us that knowledge preservation has always been a fragile process. It depended on materials, tools, skills, and the dedication of individuals committed to accuracy and tradition. Their work shaped not only what we know about the past, but also how we understand the act of learning itself. Their manuscripts were vessels of survival of language, law, faith, and story, traveling through centuries of conflict and change. Without them, entire chapters of human history might have vanished, lost to time. How did the slow, meticulous process of manuscript copying influence the way knowledge was valued and transmitted in medieval society? In what ways did the human element of scribes' work affect the texts they produced, compared to the impersonal printing press or digital text? And finally, what lessons can we draw today from a time when every word was a physical act of devotion and discipline? As these questions linger, we close the chapter on the silent scripts of the medieval scribes, a testament to endurance, craft, and the quiet power of the written word. Story 6. The quiet rise of the medieval poorhouses. Shelter in stone. The origins of charity and care. Imagine walking through the streets of a medieval town. The sounds are muted compared to today. No engines, no loud machinery, just the occasional clatter of wooden carts and murmurs of market vendors. Among the narrow alleys and bustling squares, you might notice groups of ragged figures, old men, widows, children hovering near churches or town gates. Life was harsh for many, and survival depended as much on luck and charity as on hard work. In this section, we explore the origins of medieval poorhouses, early institutions designed to provide shelter and care for the destitute. These quiet, often overlooked places were the predecessors of modern social welfare systems, yet they were shaped by complex social attitudes, religious beliefs, and practical necessities that reveal much about medieval society. Poverty in the Middle Ages was widespread and multifaceted. Crop failures, wars, plagues, and economic changes left many vulnerable. Unlike today's welfare states, medieval Europe had no comprehensive safety nets. Family, community, and religious institutions formed the backbone of support. For many, begging was the only option. Beggars appeared in every town, prompting local authorities and church leaders to wrestle with how to respond. While some viewed begging with suspicion, associating it with idleness or sin, others saw poverty as a social reality demanding Christian charity. This tension influenced the development of poor relief, which combined religious compassion with social control. The idea of the deserving poor, those unable to work due to age, illness, or misfortune, was central. Efforts to distinguish them from undeserving beggars shaped early policies. Christian doctrine placed a strong emphasis on charity. Monasteries, convents, and parish churches became centers of aid, distributing food, clothing, and sometimes shelter to the needy. Hospitals, initially religious institutions, often provided care not only for the sick but also for the poor and pilgrims. These early hospitals were part hospice, part shelter. Some, like the Hospital of St. Cross in England, combined religious worship with charitable functions. The the church's teaching encouraged almsgiving as a way to cleanse sins and earn spiritual merit. Wealthy patrons endowed almshouses or to care for the poor, linking charity with prayers for the dead. These foundations became crucial for sustaining poor relief. By the late medieval period, many towns established dedicated poorhouses, stone buildings or complexes, offering refuge. These institutions varied widely in size, quality, and services. Poorhouses often provided shelter and basic food in exchange for labor, reflecting a belief that able-bodied poor should work. Tasks included spinning wool, tending gardens, or cleaning streets. This principle aimed to discourage begging and idleness while offering structured care. Conditions in poorhouses were generally austere. Overcrowding, minimal comforts, and strict rules were common. Residents faced surveillance and discipline, reinforcing social hierarchies and control. Municipal authorities increasingly took responsibility for poor relief, especially as towns grew. Some cities passed ordinances requiring parishes to collect poor rates and local taxes dedicated to welfare. Guilds and confraternities, associations of craftsmen, or religious brotherhoods also played roles. They sometimes operated their own alms or supported members in need. These organizations reflected a mix of practical concern and social cohesion. Helping the poor was a communal duty, but also a way to maintain order and stability. As you picture the quiet stone walls of a medieval poorhouse with its simple rooms and weary inhabitants, consider the complex interplay of charity, control, and survival that defined these early shelters. They were neither prisons nor palaces, but something in between, a testament to human resilience amid hardship. What did life inside these walls feel like to those who sought refuge? How did society's attitudes toward poverty shape the care provided? And how did these humble beginnings influence later ideas about social welfare? Life inside the walls, daily reality, and social dynamics of medieval poorhouses. When you imagine a poorhouse in medieval Europe, it may bring to mind a bleak, unwelcoming place, dimly lit halls, cramped quarters, and a constant struggle for survival. While that image is not far from the truth, the reality inside these institutions was far more complex, shaped by human endurance, social rules, and religious ideals. In this section, we step behind the stone walls to explore what daily life was like for those who sought shelter in the poorhouses, their routines, challenges, and the social dynamics that governed existence in these fragile havens. Poorhouses were often modest, buildings constructed near the parish church or town center, making them visible reminders of communal responsibility. Depending on local wealth and priorities, they ranged from simple dormitories to multi-room complexes with workshops and chapels. Inside, residents typically slept in communal rooms on wooden pallets or straw-filled mattresses. Privacy was rare, and conditions were basic. Heating was minimal, often limited to a central hearth or small fireplaces. Winters could be harsh, making the stone walls cold and unforgiving. Sanitation was a constant concern. Latrines were rudimentary, sometimes simple pits outside the building, and water supply depended on nearby wells or streams. The close quarters and poor hygiene made illness common and difficult to contain. Food was sparse and simple, usually coarse bread, gruel, and occasional pottage or broth. Fresh meat and vegetables were rare luxuries. Meals were often communal affairs. Reinforcing the sense of shared hardship, poorhouses operated under strict rules, designed both to maintain order and enforce the principle that able-bodied poor should work. Entrance was controlled. Applicants had to prove their inability to support themselves, and those deemed healthy but idle were often turned away or sent to workhouses. Residents were expected to perform assigned tasks. Women might spin wool, mend clothing, or prepare food, while men repaired roads, tended gardens, or maintained the building. These activities served multiple purposes. They provided the institution with basic upkeep, deterred idleness, and instilled discipline. Attendance at religious services was compulsory. Daily prayers and mass offered spiritual comfort, but also reinforced moral lessons about charity, humility, and the dangers of sloth. Punishments for rule-breaking ranged from warnings to isolation, or in extreme cases, expulsion. The goal was social control as much as care, reflecting medieval anxieties about poverty and public order. The people living in poorhouses represented a diverse and often vulnerable population. Elderly widows, orphaned children, disabled laborers, and the chronically ill found refuge here when family support was unavailable. Some residents had lost land or employment due to economic shifts like the enclosure of common fields or changes in trade patterns, highlighting the fragile nature of medieval livelihoods. Others were refugees from war or natural disasters. Within these institutions, social bonds sometimes formed. Shared hardship fostered empathy and companionship, even as scarcity bred competition. Residents exchanged stories, cared for one another in sickness, and occasionally protested or negotiated better conditions. However, stigma surrounded poorhouse residency. Outside, these individuals were often viewed with suspicion or pity, regarded as failures or burdens. Inside, the loss of autonomy and dignity weighed heavily. Medieval poorhouses were embedded in a wider network of charity. Alms collected during church services supplemented institutional support. Wealthy patrons funded expansions or endowed chapels attached to poorhouses. Yet, charity was a double-edged sword. While it saved lives, it also enforced hierarchical relationships. Donors expected prayers and social recognition. Recipients were reminded of their dependence and moral obligations. Local officials balanced compassion with social control. Poorhouses helped reduce visible begging and vagrancy, which authorities associated with crime and disorder. Laws regulated the movement of the poor, sometimes restricting residency to prevent overcrowding. By the late Middle Ages, increasing urbanization and economic change pressured existing systems. Some towns formalized poor rates, taxes collected specifically for relief, marking a shift toward organized social welfare. Workhouses, which emphasized labor and discipline even more strictly than poorhouses, began to appear. These institutions laid foundations for the more comprehensive poor laws of later centuries. Meanwhile, monasteries and religious guilds maintained their roles, even as secular authorities expanded their influence. As you imagine the daily rhythm within these stone walls, the weary faces, the whispered prayers, the hard labor, you glimpse the delicate balance between charity and control, survival and stigma. Poorhouses were places of last resort, yet they also reflected the values, fears, and hopes of a society grappling with poverty's realities. What did it mean for a community to care for its most vulnerable while enforcing strict rules? How did the experience of institutional life affect residents' sense of identity and belonging? And how did these medieval efforts shape the long history of social welfare? From charity to social order, the legacy of medieval poorhouses. The medieval poorhouses, those quiet stone refuges scattered across towns and villages, stand at a pivotal crossroads in history, a point where charity, social control, and emerging governance intersected. While often overshadowed by grand political events and towering cathedrals, these institutions quietly shaped the trajectory of social welfare and community responsibility for centuries to come. In this final section, we trace the lasting impact of medieval poorhouses, their transformation during the early modern period, and the lessons they offer about the complexities of caring for society's most vulnerable. Medieval poorhouses represent one of the earliest forms of organized social welfare in Europe. Before their emergence, care for the poor was largely informal, dependent on family, neighbors, or the goodwill of religious communities. Poorhouses formalized this care, making it an institutional obligation rather than an optional act of kindness. This shift was closely tied to the rise of towns and the expanding role of municipal authorities. As populations grew and urban poverty became more visible, local governments began to assume responsibility for managing and funding poor relief. Poorhouses were part of this emerging social infrastructure. They not only provided shelter and food, but also acted as tools for regulating poverty, controlling who received aid, and under what conditions. This institutionalization reflected broader societal changes, the gradual movement away from feudal patronage toward centralized governance and legal frameworks. Charity became entwined with law and order, reflecting concerns about public morality, social stability, and economic productivity. By the 16th and 17th centuries, poorhouses evolved in response to changing social and economic conditions. The Reformation disrupted many religious institutions, leading to the closure or secularization of monasteries that had traditionally provided care. At the same time, rising urban populations and economic fluctuations increased demand for poor relief. In England, the Tudor Poor Laws formalized systems of assistance, creating parishes responsible for their own poor and introducing workhouses as places where able-bodied poor could be put to labor. Workhouses intensified the principle that poverty was acceptable only if coupled with willingness to work. Conditions were deliberately austere to discourage dependence, a practice reflecting enduring tensions between compassion and control. These developments laid the groundwork for modern social welfare systems, influencing policies well into the 19th and 20th centuries. Poorhouses influenced more than just social policy. They shaped perceptions of poverty and the poor. The distinction between deserving and undeserving poor, rooted in medieval charitable doctrine, persisted. For centuries, residents of poorhouses were caught between two worlds, dependent yet stigmatized, cared for yet controlled. This duality reflected societal anxieties about poverty's causes, morality, and consequences. At the same time, poorhouses fostered communities of resilience. Within their walls, people shared resources, knowledge, and companionship. Some formed lifelong bonds, creating support networks that extended beyond the institution. Religious rituals within poorhouses reinforced spiritual solace and social cohesion. The daily prayers, mass, and communal meals were more than routines. They were lifelines connecting individuals to a wider sense of meaning and belonging. Today, many medieval poorhouses have vanished or been repurposed, but some buildings remain, as silent witnesses to this chapter of history. Archaeologists studying these sites uncover artifacts and structural features that reveal everyday life inside hearths, latrines, personal items, and remnants of food. These findings enrich our understanding of medieval social welfare and the lived experience of poverty. They remind us that behind the official records and statutes were real people navigating hardship with dignity and determination. As you consider the humble origins of organized poor relief, it's striking how many challenges remain relevant, balancing compassion with sustainability, addressing stigma, and defining the role of government versus community. The medieval poorhouses teach us about the complexity of social care and how it is shaped by cultural values, economic realities, and political priorities. They reveal that caring for the vulnerable is never just a matter of charity but involves negotiation, judgment, and sometimes conflict. In our own time, as societies grapple with poverty and inequality, the story of the medieval poorhouse invites reflection. It encourages us to remember the human faces behind policy debates, and to consider how history's lessons might inform more compassionate and effective approaches. So as you drift into quiet thought, ponder this. What does it mean to build a society that cares for all its members? How do we balance fairness, responsibility, and dignity in providing support? And what enduring legacies of the medieval poorhouses still echo in our modern institutions and attitudes? Story 7. The slow burn of medieval candle making. Wax, wick, and work, the unseen craft, lighting the Middle Ages. Picture a medieval household settling into twilight. There are no electric bulbs, no gas lamps. Instead, the gentle glow of candles fills the rooms, casting flickering shadows on stone walls and wooden beams. This soft light allowed people to extend their days past sunset to read, to pray, to work, or simply to sit by the hearth. Though often taken for granted, candles were essential in medieval life, yet the process of making candles was far from simple or fast. It was a specialized craft filled with laborious steps, expensive materials, and skilled hands. In this first section, we explore the overlooked world of medieval candle making, the materials, the methods, and the economic and social role of this vital but quiet trade. Before modern lighting, darkness was a formidable barrier. Nighttime meant the end of most activities, but candles, along with oil lamps and rushlights, allowed for limited illumination after dark. Monasteries, churches, noble households, and growing towns all relied on candles. Monks needed light to copy manuscripts, merchants to continue business, and families to gather safely indoors. Religious ceremonies, too, depended heavily on candles as symbols of purity and divinity. Yet, not all candles were equal. The quality, brightness, and burn time varied greatly. Influenced by the materials and craftsmanship behind them, the two main raw materials for candles in medieval Europe were beeswax and tallow. Each had distinct properties and social implications. Beeswax was the superior choice. It burned cleanly, emitted a pleasant scent, and produced a bright, steady flame. But beeswax was expensive and limited in supply. Harvesting it required beekeeping and delicate extraction techniques. For this reason, beeswax candles were mostly reserved for churches, wealthy households, and special occasions. Tallow, rendered from animal fat, usually beef or mutton, was far cheaper and more abundant. However, tallow candles produced a smoky, flickering flame and an unpleasant odor. They burned quickly and often left residue. Because of these drawbacks, tallow candles were common among the lower classes and used for everyday lighting. The choice of material was not merely practical but also a marker of social status and wealth. Making candles was a slow, manual craft, often carried out by specialists called chandlers. The process demanded patience, precision, and cleanliness. Beeswax candles were typically made by molding or dipping. For molding, liquid beeswax was poured into clay or metal molds, sometimes shaped into tapers, pillars, or decorative forms. The wick, usually linen or hemp, was carefully placed inside before pouring. Dipping was more common for tallow candles. A wick was repeatedly dipped into melted tallow, allowed to cool, then dipped again, layer by layer, until the desired thickness was reached. This process could take hours, and the work had to be straightened and trimmed throughout. Quality control was crucial. Too thick a candle would burn poorly, too thin would not last. Wicks needed to be properly prepared to ensure even burning. Chandlers sometimes treated wicks with substances to improve performance. Candle making was often organized within guild trade associations that regulated quality, training, and market access. In many towns, chandlers had significant social and economic influence due to the essential nature of their product. Guild rules controlled who could practice the craft, ensuring standards and protecting members' livelihoods. Apprenticeships lasted years, during which novices learned the complex skills of handling wax, wicks, and molds. Guild halls and workshops were centers of both production and community life. Chandlers often participated in town governance, contributing to the civic fabric. Candles represented a significant economic sector. Demand fluctuated with seasons, religious festivals, and social customs. Church candles alone required vast quantities of beeswax, prompting specialized supply chains. Religious rituals elevated the candle beyond mere utility. Candles symbolized the light of God, spiritual purity, and hope. Candlemas, the feast, celebrating the presentation of Christ in the temple, was a major occasion for candle blessing and use. On some regions, tithes and taxes were collected in the form of candles or wax. Monasteries often kept detailed accounts of candle consumption, highlighting its role in religious and daily life. Despite its importance, candle making faced challenges. The limited supply of beeswax and the unpleasantness of tallow meant lighting was never abundant or entirely satisfactory. Candles were costly, especially for the poor, who often relied on alternatives like rushlights, simple wicks made from dried plant stalks soaked in grease, or small oil lamps. Safety was another concern. Open flames posed fire risks in towns of tightly packed wooden buildings. Accidental fires were common and devastating. As you envision the flickering candlelight illuminating a scribe's desk or a family's evening meal, consider the many unseen hands behind that gentle glow. Each candle was the product of laborious skill, careful resource management, and a complex web of social and economic factors. What daily rhythms did the demand for light impose on medieval society? How did the scarcity and expensive quality candles shape the experience of night? And how did this humble craft influence the rhythms of work, worship, and rest? The silent despair. After pushing his parents out of the house, Daniel stood in the doorway watching them walk away. His father, once strong and proud, leaned on his cane, and his mother clutched a small suitcase that barely held their belongings. They didn't cry, didn't beg, they simply walked away in silence. Daniel's wife, Monica, came and wrapped her arm around his. "Well done," she whispered. "Now we can finally have some peace in this house." Daniel didn't respond. There was an uncomfortable hollowness in his chest, but he pushed it away. He believed Monica. He told himself his parents were a burden, that they had lived their life, and now it was time for him and Monica to live theirs. For a while, things were quiet. Monica seemed happier. The house no longer smelled of old spices or echoed with his father's coughs. There were no reminders to take his mother to the doctor or wake early to prepare her herbal tea. But peace did not bring joy, and silence did not bring comfort. Daniel tried to distract himself. He immersed himself in work, stayed late at the office, and often came home to a sleeping Monica. When he did return early, she would be glued to her phone or out with friends, barely speaking to him. One night he found himself standing in the doorway of the now empty guest room in his parents' former room. The sheets had been changed, the bed unused. On a small shelf, he noticed something. An old photo of him as a child, held in his mother's arms, both of them smiling. He picked it up. His fingers trembled. Memories flooded in of bedtime stories his mother whispered, of his father carrying him on his shoulders to school when it rained, of their small family dinners filled with laughter, of his mother's soft hands tending to his fever, and of his father's strong hands lifting heavy loads, so Daniel never had to. The guilt clawed at his heart, but he buried it deep again. Months passed, and winter arrived. It was unusually harsh that year. One evening a neighbor came knocking at their door. "You knew Mr. and Mrs. Foster, right?" she asked. "Your parents?" Daniel nodded cautiously. "They've been living in an old shed behind the churchyard. Someone found them yesterday. Your father's really sick. I think you should check." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "A shed," he whispered. "Yes, it's bad. Real bad." He didn't wait. Without telling Monica, he grabbed his coat and rushed out. The churchyard was dark and quiet. Behind the small building stood a metal shed, nearly covered in snow. Daniel approached and opened the door. Inside he saw them. His mother sat huddled in a blanket, coughing violently. Her face was pale, her lips cracked. His father lay beside her, motionless. His skin looked gray under the weak light of a hanging bulb. There was no heat, no food, just two old people trying to survive in the cold. "Mum," Daniel whispered. "Dad." His mother slowly opened her eyes. "Danny," she said, voice trembling. He dropped to his knees, guilt flooding him. "I'm here. I'm so sorry." She smiled faintly, placing her thin hand over his. "We didn't want to cause trouble." Tears poured from his eyes. No, I was wrong. I'll take you home, right now." But it was too late. That his father passed away that night in the hospital. The doctor told Daniel that he had pneumonia. Had he been brought in earlier, he might have survived. Daniel's mother didn't speak much after that. She sat in silence most days, staring out the window. The spark in her eyes had dimmed up back at home. Monica was furious. "You brought her back here," she snapped. "She's my mother," Daniel said. "She's your problem. I told you before. I can't live like this." Daniel, now consumed with grief and guilt, no longer cared. "Then leave." Monica paused, stunned. "What did you say?" "I said leave," he repeated, his voice cold and final. "This house was built on their sacrifices. I kicked them out to please you, and my father died for it." She stared at him, searching for a weakness. In his resolve, finding none, she grabbed her things and walked out without another word. That Daniel took time off from work to care for his mother. He cooked for her, sat with her, read to her like she once read to him. Slowly she began to speak again, short phrases, at first, then stories from the past. One day she looked at him and said, "Your father was proud of you, Daniel. He used to say, 'My son is a good man.' He just forgot for a moment. That broke him." From that day on, Daniel made a promise to himself he would never forget again. He started volunteering at the shelter where his parents had gone for food. He offered legal help to seniors who were being exploited by landlords or family. He created a small organization in his father's name to help elderly people who had been abandoned. The more he gave back, the more peace he felt. 5 years passed. Daniel's mother died peacefully in her sleep, her hand in his dot at her funeral. The small church was full. Seniors, volunteers, young people, all whose lives had been touched by Daniel's kindness, came to say goodbye. After the service, a young woman approached him. "Mr. Foster, I want to thank you. My grandfather told me about how you helped him when he had nowhere to go. You gave him a room and respect. I'll never forget that." Daniel smiled gently. "It's the least I could do."